So, thank you for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. It's very exciting that this COP is about adaptation, a lot of conversation on adaptation, resilience taking center stage now in the conversations. We came here with the Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Hub to really talk about the importance of integrating resilient infrastructure concerns and considerations into the national adaptation strategies, because infrastructure really lies at the center of climate adaptation, mitigation, environmental concerns, and the economy, of course. In the run-up to COP, what we did was to bring together a community of practice of 39 experts, which included our member country representatives, think tanks, financial institutions, UN agencies, and others, who came together to have a conversation on what does it really mean when we say disaster resilient infrastructure needs to be integrated into climate adaptation strategies. And we were taking this forward from the work that we're already doing, our global infrastructure report, which was the first edition was launched 2 years back, and just yesterday we launched the second edition. And we talk about the resilience dividends, saying that if we invest in resilience today, that really is beneficial, because going forward, the costs that we incur now are much less than what we will incur in rebuilding the infrastructure that we lose in the event of a disaster. So just taking that conversation forward, we thought it is important to bring together experts and countries to brainstorm a little bit more and try and understand how disaster resilient infrastructure is a part of the adaptation discourse that will happen at COP30. We came with 10 sets of recommendations, broader recommendations on what this really means. Going forward, we want to continue these conversations and talk about the actual implementation. The recommendations basically were from 10 action areas, which are quite obvious. So the need for data and technology, the need for hybrid approaches such as ecosystem-based approaches, the need for innovative financing models, the need for capacity building, all of which is really going to help the governments put together a plan wherein they can start off thinking infrastructure resilience as a part of their entire planning, not just at the national level, but also at the subnational and at the city level. So bringing all of this together last week, at a UNFCCC high-level event along with IIED and in the presence of high-level representatives from UN, DRI, UNOPS, Ministry of Ireland and the Government of Antigua and Barbuda, we released this action agenda on integrating disaster-resilient infrastructure in national adaptation strategies. I will request my colleague to distribute the copies to you for your reference. And today here we bring together a panel which has experts who are part of this community of practice and also very senior representatives and our DG who will sort of discuss this in further detail, break it down for you. And we want to have a conversation that we can take forward perhaps from now until the next COP and see how we can really start talking about implementing this action plan going forward. So I'll hand it over to Aparna Roy. She was also the lead author for the action agenda. She was moderating this community of practice and she will moderate the session today. And I would like to invite Mr. Amit Pruthi, our Director General CDRI, and Mr. Gerard, Deputy Director Adaptation from UK for the first part of the panel, and then we have a set of very good speakers for the second part as well. Aparna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Suchishmita, for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and it's a privilege to welcome you all at this high-level interaction on integrating disaster-resilient infrastructure on national adaptation strategies. I think that's a conversation that sits at the heart of our global climate change challenge today. Just a quick note, or maybe my 2 cents, following or building on what Suchishmita has already mentioned. Let me begin by allow me to frame the urgency of why we are here in this conversation. I think embedding resilience is not just a strategy anymore. Embedding resilience is development itself. Countries today are not choosing between growth and resilience. They are choosing whether their development pathways still would be able to withstand the shocks that are already unfolding. And infrastructure is where this choice becomes real. Every road, port, bridge, hospital, and power system that we build today without resilience is a future risk disguised in progress. And every system that we design with resilience at its core would unlock economic stability, social protection, and long standing long term development gains. And this is why this convening matters, because integrating resilient infrastructure into national adaptation strategies, it is not a technical priority. It's a fundamental shift in how nations secure their future. So let's begin with this as the tone at the top. I think this conversation is not about possibilities, it's a conversation about imperatives. And there's no better way to begin with other than the two leaders we have with us today. Thank you for joining. One of the common questions that I would begin with is, what is your core message to countries on how they should start thinking about embedding infrastructure resilience within their national adaptation plan and strategy? Dr. Prothi, first I'll ask you to answer this.
Thank you so much. It's the $1 million or a $1 billion or the $1 trillion question, depending on who you're asking. Yesterday, the minister from Ghana was here, and he made a comment which has stuck to me. When we talk about NAPs, NAPs are sitting in Ministry of Environments. Now, the Ministry of Environment is not the development ministry. What we're asking, in a way, is Ministry of Environment to demonstrate the importance of this agenda for the development of a nation, but coordinating with the ministries that are actually pursuing the pathways for development. So that's the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of your infrastructure ministries, others, right? So one fundamental shift that is required in a number of countries, some are doing it well, others are not yet at that point, is that getting the message of resilience to the ministries that are responsible for development. And it's not that it's not happening, but it's happening in a little bit of an ad hoc manner. So I'll give you another example. I had a long conversation with somebody in the Ministry of Railways in India. And I was talking about, extreme heat is now a problem in India and other parts of the world. And he said, but we know that. We're already working towards that. Our rail tracks are now designed to withstand certain amounts of temperature. Our trains are running in a way where we are managing water so that we have water. Our air conditioning within the trains is so. But that's never captured necessarily in the NAPs. And that's happening because the ministries responsible for infrastructure, for development, are pursuing with a somewhat of an understanding that risks are increasing, but what they don't have sometimes is the collective understanding of what does that mean for the nation's development agenda. And I think the NAPs provide a fantastic opportunity to start to anchor what is going on in the different ministries already, and starting to give it direction from a much more strategic perspective to say, and then that also gives an opportunity for sharing. So what the Indian Railways is doing is something that other parts of the world, I was in Netherlands about 5 years back, and I wanted to take I was flying out of Schiphol airport. I was in Amsterdam. The train between Amsterdam and Schiphol airport, which is about 40 minutes, wasn't working because the temperature had exceeded 35 degrees centigrade. Because those systems are not designed for extreme heat, whereas the Indian systems are being designed, right? So I think NAP provides a fantastic opportunity to capture what's going on and give it some more strategic direction, which can then help inform the ministries of development, finance, etc., to say, okay, what we are doing now with a much more strategic focus can help pursue development, but with the resilience.
Thank you, Dr. Prothi. Gerald, we move on to you. You are the Deputy Director Adaptation for UK, and I think this is also a $1 million question for you.
It is indeed. Thank you very much indeed for having us here today. Congratulations on the launching of the report. It's a really interesting point about the way in which national adaptation plans intersect with core government economic and development planning. And I suppose that the key message that I would take away is that infrastructure has to be at the very core, a foundation of a national adaptation plan. But it's not just at the foundation of the National Adaptation Plan, it's actually at the core of the country's economic growth and stability plan. And in a way, I would like us to see us understanding NDCs and NAPs and NBSAPs as lenses through which to understand national planning, resilience work, risk understanding, because I think whilst they remain siloed, we have a problem doing exactly what you say, Doctor, in terms of moving them across. So we actually have to see that infrastructure is an investment in economic stability and well-being, and no doubt we'll talk more later on about the way in which infrastructure serves communities and households and drawing that link, but that shift has to come, and that's also about integrating at a national and a subnational level elements of risk through infrastructure planning and planning for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And I think one of the issues about NAPs is they are not that sort of long term. So it's about how we bring NAPs to harness that level of economic planning integration. Thank you.
Fantastic. Ms. Pruthi, I'll come to you next. So CDRI has supported the community of practice, right, which actually led to the building of the action agenda on integrating disaster risk into national adaptation plans and strategies. But when we talk about hardwiring infrastructure into resilience from the hardwiring resilience into infrastructure from the very beginning and not as an added later, which is right now what is the thing happening across the country, right? It's a secondary add-on in most of the countries. What do you think is a fundamental shift that is required, whether in terms of finance and how we budget, how we plan, that would lead to embedding resilience critically from the very beginning rather than having it as an add-on?
Yeah. So, I think the Ministry of Finance and the development ministries are going to be incredibly important partners in taking forward this agenda. So, for CDRI, because we are uniquely set up to focus on DRI, I mean, our agenda is DRI, right? So, we're spending a lot of effort, and if you look at the report that came out yesterday, we're targeting messages to the different stakeholders whose responsibility it is to start to understand resilience. So, for example, we did some work with the National Infrastructure Pipeline in India, which is the $1.5 trillion pipeline of investments that the country at the national level has identified for infrastructure development. With them, we sat down and we actually helped them understand what is the opportunity for embedding resilience in your cost-benefit analysis. So, and they've actually really found it to be quite exciting because it's not something that they have ever spent. Most economists today or financial planners today have not grown up studying how to integrate climate risk into their decision making, right? So, if we can, the community of experts here who understand how to look at risk, future risk, probabilistic risk, uncertainties around risk, and then translate that in a language for the financiers, whether it's national banks, whether it's the Ministry of Finance, that will go very far. Again, another anecdote, a very good colleague, somebody I know very well, heads a massive investment bank in New York. She's the head of mergers and acquisitions, and I had lunch with her about a month and a half ago. She's a classmate from high school, and we were chatting, and she said, we have a whole department of climate science people working for us. So the merger and acquisition community has already started to include climate scientists, and this climate scientist he's talking about was somebody who worked for FEMA, was one of their chief climate scientists, who's now working for the private sector, for the banking sector, for the investment community, because they have already started to figure out that this is something they cannot avoid when they're thinking about supply chains. Now, the policy people here, we're all coming from the policy mindset. We need to start to get better at saying how does the finance ministry, how does the economic development, how do they start to factor this at the upstream level and in the decision making about budgets, etc. Right? So if we can get that right, then the incentives will come to take this forward.
So in the systems thinking, the language of how you translate what's needed to who finance is very important. taking the cue from there, I want to ask you my next question around finance, which is very important and fundamental to make this shift happen. But we know that any finance flowing towards adaptation is just a fraction of what is needed. I would not go into data, we all know that. It's an established fact. So, what is the political and financial breakthrough that you see we need to adapt to unlock the large scale investments that are needed to embed resilience into the infrastructure designs?
I mean, in one sentence, the breakthrough is to get the valuation right? And it's to value the risk properly, and it is also to value the dividend. And that's a really important part. So jobs saved, for example, trade sustained, health impacts avoided. Currently, they're invisible in the cost-benefit analysis that most people do. So we need long-term risk-informed planning that really moves that. Now, look, you're exactly right. The overall finance package for adaptation is still too low, and of that, not enough is going into the right things, infrastructure, in the right ways. So whilst there is finance clearly going into infrastructure, more risk-informed infrastructure planning and execution is going to be a really important part of that. I think finance ministries are not getting involved at an early enough stage in some of the planning for infrastructure development. And therefore infrastructure is lacking credible financing strategies from all sources to move it forward. And so we do need new valuation frameworks. That's something the CDRI can help with, because otherwise proper and resilient infrastructure looks expensive when actually it's very fiscally wise. And that's a huge gulf that we have to get over in order to build these credible pathways that can actually show the value of finance, show the value of valuing risk and return properly, and build those medium-term infrastructure strategies.
So, about credible pathways, Dr. Prothi, you have worked with government in India and elsewhere at a very close range. So, what do you think are the most persistent bottlenecks that country face? Is it the data? Is it capacity gaps? Or is it simple political will? Why is it that embedding adaptation into national strategies is either not happening or happening in a very fragmented fashion, like you just said?
Yeah. And first of all, I just have to correct, I'm not a doctor. I was
Sorry.
pursuing it, never finished it. So someday I may, but not yet. So, when you start to, it's a complex challenge, right? Let's not simplify this. It's an incredibly complex challenge. And you have to work on all of the layers or all of the components of the problem, right? So you highlighted already data, capacity building. So let me start with capacity building first. If you need to build an incredible amount of infrastructure that's being built right now, Africa, India, South Asia, if you start looking around the world, there's a lot of infrastructure investments going in. But the professionals who are needed to promote resilience, that is still a massive gap, right? So I think most professionals have been taught to build infrastructure in a certain way. They do it well. That's what they've been taught. But they have not yet been taught in a way which gives them confidence to innovate. So when you talk about now nature-based solutions as one of the ways of addressing flood risk, for example, most communities, most political leaders, most people making decisions on the projects will ask, the first question will be, have you done this before? Where does this work? Do our codes and standards support it? Right? And very often you find that the codes and standards don't support it. The experience of other parts of the, within the country or outside is very minimal at some, you can't just go and say, look at these 10 examples of how an urban flood project involved nature-based solutions. So those examples are far and few. And then the confidence of the technical people who are actually thinking through this project is still, the confidence is still work in progress, right? So to me, these are going to be the challenges that one has to address while starting to, at the highest level, makes absolute sense. Once you start coming down, I'll give you another example. We've looked at um, coastal infrastructure for electricity, transmission and distribution, and where wind speeds are changing. We found that infrastructure has been designed to wind speeds in accordance to the code that was written in 1995. Wind speeds are way beyond that already, right? So you need to actually then upgrade the code, the wind code. But that's a massive undertaking as well, right? So all of these are actually going to be important as we move forward.
Gerald, in terms of the future trends, what do you think are some of the emerging risks, whether it's finance, geopolitical, there are technological risks, that you think the majority of countries are severely underestimating right now when it comes to creating disaster resilient infrastructure for the future?
Yeah, thanks. And I think the question is not just about countries, it's about the global community underestimating some of that. So I was just at the first high-level dialogue on adaptation about an hour and a half ago or so. And one of the panelists there talked about the need for us to be thinking about how adaptation crosses sectors, crosses borders, crosses themes, and is intersectional in its impacts. And we talk often about intersectionality as experienced by people and households, but the same is true of infrastructure. And so what we've got to do is move into much more of a systems way of thinking about how we think about infrastructure resilience, because we know that actually it's not just one single risk. It's, for example, about how digital risks coincide with technological risks, which coincide with geopolitical risks, coincide with, as you said, increased wind speeds, right? And so infrastructure designed for the historical averages you were talking about in 1995 is failing under these extremes, and yet our planning is not taking fully into account multi-hazard scenarios or consequent effects. The UK's own National Adaptation Plan, National Adaptation 3, has a set of cascading risks in it, where we attempt to look at what would happen if a number of risks coincide. That's proving to be very hard work, actually, and we've got some great minds working on it. So I'd also come back to this point on capability and support in order to build those sorts of things in, because ultimately we have to show how risks interconnect and how that interconnection produces new forms of risk that we're going to have to anticipate and build for in the medium term.
Right. So, very interesting comment that when we create these infrastructures, we have to recognize that we create this for people. Mr. Proti, how do we ensure that the new infrastructures and the resilient ones that we are creating are actually not just assets that we are building, but we ensure that we are building it for the people and for the community who needs it? Because a lot of time, even in our country, a lot of policies and practice are not demand driven, right? So
I think when I joined CDRI 3.5 years ago, why are we building infrastructure? So if I ask you that fundamental question, why are we building infrastructure? We're building infrastructure to serve some purpose for the community. We're building roads for access to markets, etc. We're building hospitals to provide social services. We're providing schools to provide education. So it's really critical for the infrastructure planners, designers, etc. to actually look at infrastructure not as the end result, but what is the purpose of that infrastructure. And if we start to shift that mindset and then start to put all the elements that we all keep talking about in this community, community participation, demand driven, like how do you get the processes right so that what you're designing is actually for people. Now from a resilience point of view, we're also very careful in saying, and the report talks a little bit about this, is that when you're building infrastructure and there is an event that takes place, disasters happen because the infrastructure is not serving the purpose for which it was designed. So how do you bring in elements of resilience where the community continues to function even though the infrastructure is not working? Right? Resilience is not about, it's actually the community continuing to function despite an event that's good. So I'll give you one example from Singapore. Now, Singapore has one of the best flood management system in the world. Okay, I mean, if you go and look up, they're probably very, very well. They do their engineering and other forms of nature-based, except they do that right. But even they have recognized that the changing risk profile, they will never be able to address the entire risk of flooding in their country. So what have they started doing? They started providing education to people to say, look, we are trying to protect you from floods, but tomorrow there may be a flood. And if there is a flood, here are the things that you need to do. So they're actually involving the community and saying, can you be better prepared? Because we are on the government side and are building the infrastructure to be flood, to give you that protection, but at the same time, we're also recognizing we may not be able to protect you completely, and then you have a responsibility also in this whole resilience story.
Oh, the same question. How do we ensure that it protects people? Well, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is whose risk counts, whose benefits are costed, and how do we build that into planning? And we must always remember that when we talk about resilience, what resilience means on a human level is, for me at least, it means I feel I have the ability to cope. Right? That's the starting point. Everything else is a means to that end. And I think, so therefore we should be looking at how resilient infrastructure protects people. It enhances and addresses the risks as they understand it. And so that when we are designing flood infrastructure, we're thinking about how does that protect low-income households nearby. Very often, we also know that people who are most vulnerable have the fewest assets. So we're having to change the cost-benefit analysis, right? Because actually, in monetary value, we're protecting a lower amount of asset, but in human value, we're protecting a much higher level of asset. And I think that fundamental mind shift needs to happen. Nature-based solutions can play a huge part in this. So, for example, mangrove protection can provide protection against storm surge, but also enhance livelihoods for female fisher folk and fishing communities. So finding those win-wins, counting risk properly, and understanding benefits from community and household level.
My last question to you, and a very quick one. So as the countries are preparing to launch the new National Adaptation Plan, what would be your one key message to them on how they can do it right?
So I think NAPs, again, going back to my first response, because the Ministry of Environment are necessarily the ones responsible for preparing NAPs, how they work with the other ministries becomes absolutely critical. Because this is not the Ministry of Environment's document, this is the country's document. And to the extent that coordination can happen at the highest level, recognizing that other ministries are actually doing the work of infrastructure resilience, but they're sharing that information with the Ministry of Environment, who's responsible for coordination. I think if that shift we can see that shift, we'll see the NAPs being more effective.
I very much agree, and I mean I think we've said it already. It's about moving from a siloed approach, and if I was to give you a sentence, I think it's about systemic, risk-informed, whole of society, medium-term resilience planning, right? So, and on each of those words hangs a whole set of capability, a whole set of reforms, and a whole set of data and perspectives. But if we can get to that or towards that, we're going to see an acceleration and ultimately better protection, enhancement of people and their livelihoods, which is infrastructure as a means to an end, and that is that end that we need to aim for. Thank you.
So I think very clear messaging. First, we need to think of whose resilience are we talking about, and then when we create these infrastructure and assets, we need to work across department, and embrace intersectionality in our approach to resilience planning. And then when we come down to actually seeing where the money needs to go, there's a need for proper valuation and risk-informed planning across every aspect. Thank you so much to the both of you for this very, very good roundup of comments. And with this, we stop the we pause a bit, we stop the fireside chat, and I would now ask the next panel to come in and take the seats. But before that, we will do some chair additions. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think the flow, and as our colleagues to the housekeeping exercises. Let's just go ahead with taking on from what we have discussed in the conversation here so far. I think the conversation had set very clear foundation for resilience thinking. A, that it is not just and would not be an add-on to the development process. It needs to sit at the core of development itself. And yet, unfortunately, across countries, what we see happening is that the ambition often fails to translate into actions on ground. And that is where, as Mr. Amit Prathi was mentioning, translating that language on how different sectors and different systems would understand resilience would be extremely important. But I think it is not a technical challenge. It is, what would succeed in making that happen is a political choice. It's a test for the government and a development imperative. Before I invite all my co-panelists, I think I would like to take the conversation here, beginning with three major provocations that would guide the discussions today. First are, what is the illustration of preparedness? Are countries genuinely integrating resilient infrastructure into their adaptation strategy, or are we just making glossy pilot plans to look better on our sheets? The second provocation would be the equity gap. If infrastructure is meant to protect people, as the last part of the conversation was, why do communities most exposed to climate risk continue to be last to benefit from that resilient system? And the third and final provocation that would guide is the financing paradox, which keeps coming again every time we speak about integrating resilience into infrastructure or say any system of ours, that the world knows that every dollar we invest in resilient infrastructure saves many more lives and many more money and helps in avoiding losses. So why do finances still flow overwhelming to response and reconstruction rather than helping in embedding resilience at the very heart of infrastructure itself? And I'm joined by a stellar panel today to discuss around these three provocations. First, I would invite Ms. Diane Black-Lane as Ambassador of Climate Change, Government of Antigua and Barbuda. Welcome and thank you for joining us in this discussion. Please. Ms. Larissa Carolina Santos, Sustainability Program Director. Unfortunately, she's not here with us. Ms. Chibesa Pensulo, Commonwealth Regional Climate Finance Advisor for Africa, the Commonwealth Secretariat. Mr. Mafua Maka, National Disaster Risk Management Office. Mafua, are you here? Okay. And Dr. Emily Wilkinson, Principal Research Fellow and Director, Resilient and Sustainable Island Initiative, ODI Global. Carlos Arenas, DG, UNGRD, Colombia. Okay, and Lincoln Alves, Head Adaptation, Ministry of Environment, Brazil. So I want to first start the conversation and begin with Chibesa Pensulo. Sorry. Chibesa, I want to begin with you because you represent the Commonwealth that spans across 56 nations, right? And with diverse vulnerabilities. What is the single most scalable approach that you have seen had worked very well in embedding resilient infrastructure in national adaptation strategies? Just again a housekeeping suggestion that I would request each of the panelists to have their first round of interventions limited to 5 minutes so that we can go on to other rounds and all take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Aparna, and I think I'll speak for less than 5 minutes. And good morning or good afternoon, dear colleagues. Great to meet all of you here today. Now, you may be wondering why the Commonwealth is here. What is the Commonwealth Secretariat doing in this discussion? If we look at the 51 countries that are members of this coalition, 20 of them are also members of the Commonwealth. And so it is critical for us as our new strategy focuses on environmental resilience, to be part of conversations that raise the awareness around environmental resilience, particularly in infrastructure. And so we as the Commonwealth Secretariat operate what we call the Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub. And the way it is structured is that we have a team of thematic specialists that are based in the hub in Mauritius. We also have regional advisors that are based in regional organizations that are accredited to the multilateral climate funds, and that helps to bring in the resources that we need to make this resilience transition in infrastructure. And then beyond that, we also embed national advisors in the government ministries responsible for climate action and for finance. And so when you ask me what is the most scalable model for ensuring that disaster resilient infrastructure gets embedded into the NAPS and other climate strategies, I would say that we need to go about addressing the capacity gap. Action item 8 of the action agenda is around capacity development. And I think that what we've put in there focuses a lot on training. But doing fly-in, fly-out training has been proven over and over not to be sustainable. And that's why we've taken the approach of actually embedding experts into national governments who then build capacity internally in government ministries. And that is the model that we think is scalable, because that means that even when our expert leaves after their 3-year period of deployment in the country, they've built sufficient capacity in the ministries responsible for climate action and finance for them to then carry on, and to also embed the importance of resilient infrastructure into the NAPS, into the NDCs, that they, alongside our advisors, will be taking part in.
So that gets us to actually understanding how strategic planning and investments should be and where they should go. Emily, my next question to you is that, as we were discussing in the fireside chat, that countries often treat resilient infrastructure as a added cost rather than a strategic investment. And strategic investment is required actually to fill up a lot of gap, that the capacity gap that she had mentioned, technology and other gaps that we would be discussing through. So what evidence or economic framing would finally change this either policy or political behavior towards actually making it a strategic investment priority rather than an added cost?
Thanks very much. So, I mean, a lot of our work is focused on small island developing states. I'm going to talk from that perspective a little bit. We actually reviewed all of the SIDS, NAPS, NDCs, adaptation communications and biennial transparency reviews, and 90% of them do prioritise resilient infrastructure. So I don't actually think this is a problem of lack of political will. I don't think this is a political economy issue. That's not the main constraint. Countries do want to invest in resilient infrastructure. They're trying to find ways to do that. Of course, there are lots of statistics of $1 invested in resilient infrastructure produces cost savings of $10 or $12 or $8. I think obviously it's complicated and it depends on the context, the type of investment particularly, and where it is. So, I mean, I think while that's useful as a high-level sort of framing point, I don't think it's going to, drive sort of further motivate investment. I think that motivation is already there. What is really useful is the more granular analysis of where those the co-benefits are. And I think, for example, we can expect to see significant co-benefits of resilient infrastructure investment when the solutions are nature-based, and that was mentioned in the chat previously. So I think that's where we need to get really granular and understand which of these kinds of approaches and solutions are going to generate the greatest kind of benefits, so that these do become investable projects, because countries are going to have to probably a significant amount of countries are going to have to borrow in order to make these investments. So we need to really be able to look at what the benefits are, and I'll come back to the sort of financial instruments maybe later. And I think the thing to remember is this is really technically very, very complicated. When I speak to finance colleagues, I think sometimes there's a sort of glossing over of the difficulties of investing in resilient infrastructure. You know, no government or country can make their infrastructure 100% resilient. It's just not possible. There are so many trade-offs and uncertainties and hidden costs and technical performance issues in structures and materials and so on and so on that actually require systems approach. You've got to have a lot of people around the table to plan and implement every single part of your kind of infrastructure program. So that's a huge effort, and I think we need to think about and acknowledge all of these things in the NAPs that needs to go in there, not just this is what we want to do, this is a kind of a costing of those investments, but how it's actually going to happen. And I think the sort of the planning and implementation lift around that, how that's going to work. And also just the other thing I wanted to point out is a lot of this resilient infrastructure investment is happening in recovery, and so I don't think we can separate the two things. I don't think we can say let's do the NAP and plan for and implement the NAP as if there's not going to be any extreme weather events during that implementation. I think we need to, the NAP should acknowledge that there may well be, and the risk assessments can tell us that what kind of impacts we might expect from different types of events and the probability of those occurring, and consider how that program can be advanced in a recovery phase. Like, where is the finance going to come from? Sometimes there is more opportunity to raise money, but it can it's messy. So I think that needs to be part of the discussion, because it is the reality. We don't want to wait until disasters to invest in resilient infrastructure, but that will be when a lot of the investment happens.
Talking of small island developing countries, carrying forward from what Emily said, we'll go to somebody who's the heart of planning there already. Ms. Diane Blacklin, so we all know that small island developing countries face extremely disproportionate risk from climate change, right? That threatens their infrastructure at a scale that we can't think of. So how can this global adaptation planning, you think, better integrate resilience for the small island developing countries today?
Okay, so thank you for that question. So I'm from a very small island. We're in the hurricane belt, and we are suffering from, I think we were one of the first countries that get hit by a hurricane category 5. So we understand what Jamaica is going through. It totally wiped out our sister island. I lived on the mainland. My home was 30 miles from 180 miles an hour wind. But luckily, those type of storms tend to be very narrow in terms of the eye wall, but very intense. So, I get goosebumps thinking about it. My country is an island. We have almost 100% desalination now. Then we have heat. And so the infrastructure consideration for us, and which was included in our NAPs, I agree with my colleague there, that the NAPs in many island states is very comprehensive. And we do work very closely with our ministries of finance. However, our ministries of finance are really way behind the curveball when it comes to many issues. So we're talking about climate change issues, environmental issues, and the incorporation of the same into just general policy, fiscal policy, as well as in the design of projects and programs. And then finally, the Ministries of Finance team is a very unique bunch of persons. And they tend to try to you have to look at who is running the Ministry of Finance. It's either an economist or accountant, a finance person. They're not engineers, they're not environmental management, so on, and they're not interested in the process of developing an apps. They just don't care. And this is why the Ministry of Environment have had to be taken on additional duty. It is additional for them. It is not the role of them, it should not be the role of the Ministry of Environment to do this. But we're the ones who are the advocate in our country, our respective country. We're the one here. So my Ministry of Finance, the Department of the Environment, it's an accredited entity to the Adaptation Fund and to the Green Climate Fund. I sat on the board of the Green Climate Fund. I'm sitting on the board of the Adaptation Fund, and I cannot get the Ministry of Finance to even come to COP. So the first time I finally put my foot down, I said, no, you have to come to COP. By the way, our Prime Minister and ministers are all on board. was in 2019, and then and then of course we had COVID right after that. But and then we asked them, our Ministry of Finance sits on the loss of damage fund, and they were like, these people are crazy over here. Like what kind? It's a completely different culture, and in their culture, they tax and spend, borrow and spend. Right? That takes up their whole day and month and weeks. Anything outside of that, you're lucky if you get a response from them. So this has been one of the problems. And when they go, they get money from either taxes or they get money from banks, development banks. That's it. Now the Caribbean Development Bank, which is one of our banks, and then we have the World Bank. Those are two banks, and many of the development banking sector have something called an internal rate of return. The current internal rate of return for the Caribbean Development Bank, if you're borrowing, can only take into consideration a 1 in 25-year event. There is no way you can incorporate a category 3 hurricane into that, or heat, or gender, or women, all of the other stuff that we want to throw into it. It just doesn't provide that. So to provide that, you have to blend it with grants. Same thing with the World Bank today. That is changing, but today as we sit here, the persons who have to lend us the money for all of this, that project is not bankable. And that is it. Within the private sector, you're finding, so let's look at infrastructure for public, look at infrastructure for a family. To make, as previous, the fireside chat said, for people, what would make a person feel safe, even though the infrastructure fails? So your home, or the shelter, or your church, or your community school, those community infrastructure. And you cannot build them without grants. And we are a high income country. So when you look at the community infrastructure, the family infrastructure, and the government infrastructure all at once, and then when we are coming to places like this, we're all competing, even at the national level, for the small amount of money to mix it in. And then that competition in itself creates chaos and problems, and we just don't move forward.
We'll come back to that. That's a very important point. I think a lot of countries which actually benefit from thinking how this approach can change. But I'll go to Carlos Arenas next. So Carlos, Colombia has been strengthening, or at least by the book we know that they are strengthening their national disaster or risk management for years. So what do you think, like moving on from challenge to what has worked for other countries that could serve as best practices sitting at COP, what do you think could be the kind of governance reforms that are that have enabled Colombia to integrate resilience into their national adaptation strategies, and that can help other countries embed the same?
Thank you very much for having us today. Well, this is kind of a tricky question. I'm going to set up the timer because we politicians, we talk a lot. So maybe after 20 minutes, I will realize that the time is over. I'm the general director of UNGRD, that is kind of the Colombian FEMA, of course with less budget. But for a year, I was also in charge of Adaptation Fund. The Colombian Adaptation Fund is a temporary institution that was created 15 years ago so that we can kind of rebuild quickly. 2010, we had huge floods, so the government, Santos government, decided to create that temporary fund. So the institutions are created. Colombia, in fact, had a framework that could be enough and technical and follow all this Sendai stuff and whatever you want. So by the book is great, and probably people before me in my position, they came to these COPs and they tell everyone everything is great and Colombia is doing great, the Colombian miracle, blah, blah, blah. But actually, I do think it's about political willing. There is a huge hypocrisy in the governments when they go to international scenarios and they said everything's going great, but there is a huge hidden cost in infrastructure, resilient infrastructure in all our projects, and it is corruption. I don't know about other countries, maybe more developed countries, but Latin American countries, and especially Colombia, is still facing a huge amount of corruption. And that corruption was increased by this neoliberal book after 80s Thatcherism and Reagan and all this influence in Latin American governance, everything is private. We don't have a infrastructure minister. I'm the general director of this, and I don't even have, bulldozer. I don't have anything. I cannot build up anything. I have to hire a private. And all these private companies are run by politicians. If we are in Brazil, we all know about Odebrecht stuff. Odebrecht scandal actually overthrown governments around Latin America, and in Colombia nothing happened. The guy that was about to talk about that corruption scandal, the controller, Odebrecht controller, was killed. He was poisoned with cyanide. And then his son came to his house after he passed away, drank the water, and was killed too. It's like medieval times. People being killed with cyanide. And everything goes around infrastructure. So I do think it's about political willing. It's about talking openly about this corruption scandal and actually force the governments to stop their greed. I think this is a basic point. So if you ask me what Colombia can teach others about this, it's speaking openly about what's happening and try not to do that again anymore. It doesn't matter if it's a rightist government or if it's leftist government as we are now. It's just about being sincere.
That is interesting. So, talking about political will, Lincoln, I'll go to you next. President Lula had said, and we all know that this is the adaptation COP, this is the implementation COP. A lot of what we aspired, anticipated, and a lot of what we planned over the last 10 years after committing to Paris, if they are to be implemented now and over the next 10 years to make the world actually a resilient place to be, that implementation needs to happen within infrastructures, whether it's cutting down the emission, whether it's helping the communities from small island, helping developing nations grow, and not let climate change take back the development gains that have been made until date. The infrastructures need to be adapted, the infrastructures need to be resilient. How do you think can the action agenda support that ambition?
Good morning, everyone. Thank me have here. It's a good opportunity to share our Brazilian experience, and allow me to begin with a very simple observation that in terms of the implementation, that we don't fail for lack of commitment, but we are not fail for the lack of implementation. And based on that, to turn the ambition in results. First, I think we need to much change the way of the country, the government, and the institution, change the way of the cooperation. This is one of the pillars that I think it's crucial. And based on that, Brazil has been work a lot in terms to make this strategy more robust in a way. So in this contest, Brazil made the strategic choice that work in terms of the multi-level, multi-sector, and participatory governance in the center of this climate strategy. So our NAPS was based in these four main places. And then during this COP, we launched the multi-level governance acceleration plan. That's the backbone of this plan. It's the Adapta Cities initiative. So we are not talking about increase the resilience of infrastructure without look for the cities. So one of the main goal of this initiative is to support the cities in terms of capacity building, financial, data access. So in this initiative, we are initially working with 581 cities in Brazil that represent more than 5 million of Brazilian cities or people. And one of the crucial elements that we have, and our previous speaker touched, is that to progress of this possibility is based on four structural pillars: the governance, capacity, data information, and means of implementation. So to enhance all these effort in Brazil, it's very crucial to enhance the governance. We have to put together not only the national government, but subnational civil society and private sectors. And the capacity is very crucial, as our colleagues said, training people, to training stakeholders in the cities, because it's very clear when we talk this subnational stakeholder, the, most of them doesn't extend to really know what climate change is, doesn't understand the risk in the territory, in the sector, so there's very crucial the capacity. And also the data and information, it's very important as well, because Brazil, it's a huge country, different characteristics, so to provide access to this kind of information, it's crucial. And of course, last but it's not least, means of implementation to access financial, it's crucial. But before to provide them, it's important to teach them how to access these, to capacity them to write a good proposal to submit and access, because this is our reality in Brazil. Most of the subnation doesn't have this capacity to write a very good proposal to submit that. So yeah, so to very close for this first round, I think our aim is to capacity the city and the stakeholder to create a very foundation in the implementation agenda that link the national to subnational.
Right. So, three important takeaways from what you just said. One is changing the means of cooperation. Second is multi-level governance, and third is based on what you were saying about capacity building. Right. So, if we merge the three, what are the different capacity reforms that you see at different levels? Right. What are the cooperations for building some of those capacity? What are the governance reforms to build the capacity are needed regionally, nationally, and locally? To kind of most dramatically accelerate embedding resilience into infrastructure?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Can I focus on the national level? Because I think that's the level at which we need the greatest amount of reform. Now, what we ought to recognize is that when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about the built environment, right? That's exactly what infrastructure is. It is the built environment. But how is it that when it comes to responding to climate change, which affects not only the natural environment but also the built environment, we only allow the ministry responsible for the natural environments to take the lead? I think that the biggest government reform or governance reform that needs to be made is that the ministry responsible for infrastructure should be mandated alongside the ministry responsible for environment to take the lead on climate action. So it can no longer be the case that the Ministry of Environment is alone in the lead on this, because also they often lack the convening power to gather the other ministries. So a few years ago, before I joined the Commonwealth Secretariat, I was the NAP specialist at the Green Climate Fund. And so it was interesting to look at it from that perspective, because we were making the funding available for development of NAPs, so it wasn't a funding issue anymore that was the problem in the country. They have the money from the GCF. It wasn't a political will issue. The Ministry of Environment is there, the Ministry of Finance is there. But who is the missing person in the room? It's the ministry responsible for infrastructure, for the built environment. So once we have a situation where Ministry of Infrastructure alongside with Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Finance are taking the lead on climate action, I think we'll be making a good way forward.
So bringing it all down to actually burning the institutional silos that persist within the countries. Ms. Diane Lane, you were talking about some of the challenges, very interesting challenges around grant within the country. So if adaptation is to be made the development in the small island developing countries as well as that of yours, what is where you would think the need of rethinking infrastructure planning lies that would not just help the infrastructures withstand climate shock, but also improve the kind of economic sovereignty and long-term prosperity of the nations?
Right. So in our case, we're a really tiny country, and like in most countries. So we all talk about, when you talk CDRI, people think big infrastructure, or roads and bridges and so on. But there is soft infrastructure, hard and soft infrastructure, and like mangroves and others. So my department is the Department of the Environment, and when we did the National Adaptation Plan, we wrote our role and what we see as our personal role in addition to the infrastructure. I want to, and based on that, we decided it's not what is the priority and what we need to do, it's what we can do at this point. And there is something called coalition of the willing or the coalition of the ready. And then there's a risk when you design a project and implement it. I was speaking to my team this morning about that. I listened to my colleague from Colombia, and he's correct. So there are some ministries in my government, of course, where they will not be able to. We can't, as an accredited entity, and based on the fiduciary standards that we have and the zero tolerance for prohibitive practices, we couldn't work with them, right? Because we have to prove we're not corrupt, right? That's how our projects are designed and our operational system. And it's not that corruption necessarily be taking place. That is also the case, may not be as prevalent, but that does happen. But we can't, there's no paper trail. They don't like to prepare project document. I mean, we have roads built and buildings built in my country by the government without any drawings, without an engineering drawing. And there are engineers and staff. I mean, this is how basic it is. My department, we review all of the environmental impact assessments. We conduct all the flood vulnerability assessment as a matter of our role as legislation. So we see our work that we're doing with the NAPS, thank you for that, we got our NAPS funding, is to assess, to help the different agencies to be in compliance with our national development laws. Now, when you're in a country, many of our countries, and the government is responsible for the development, they don't see that they necessarily have to meet the standards, the engineering standards or the code. Sometimes they don't even want to apply to the physical planning department for permission. So in one case, we had a road that is being constructed with funding from the Caribbean Development Bank. The Caribbean Development Bank and the World Banks, they have privileges and immunities, right? So it means that they actually don't need, they see it and interpret that, they don't need to get physical planning permission. So the Caribbean Development Bank started the project without physical planning permission, and I sent my officers and issued them a stop order. Right? So our goal is to make sure they're in compliance and insist that they're in compliance. And many development banks want to just tick a box, which is not what we want. This is not what our community deserves. So basically, what our projects and our project are not designed. So we have infrastructure, the big ones. We have the community infrastructure, and we have the household infrastructure. Household level infrastructure in the Caribbean, we're all ready to go. Community, they're all ready to go. And there's not enough money to help them. They're willing to abide by the rules and procedures. We avoid, when you're doing the big projects from governments, the issue of corruption is a problem. And so we just pretty much, I'll sit here and tell you, yes, big infrastructure is important, but we can't work with them right now, based on how all of the stuff that everybody would have said. But a homeowner who wants a house that can withstand a category 3 or 4, we have in abundance, and that is what we decided. We're going to work with them, and we're going to work with the churches and the communities, and that is going really well. We don't have the problems that we have in others. We have political support to utilize the funds from the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, to do that. And I must say that's what we have been working on doing. But at some point, we cannot avoid the reality of pulling together a whole team to look at the infrastructure, the big infrastructure. But in the meantime, we do what we can. That's all we do.
Yes, but I think that is also a very important intervention, to have the communities become the heart of the process of that change already. Emily, what are some of the innovative models through your work across the small island nations that you have seen, whether they are standards, financing, public-private partnerships, or even risk analytics, that have the highest potential to close the infrastructure, to close the resilient infrastructure gap that or the challenge that we are talking about?
Thank you. I was going to say something about getting more concessional finance flowing into countries, but sort of reflecting a bit on Diane's point, I also want to make a point about community infrastructure. So, at the macro level, it's really important that we need to get just a lot more cheap finance flowing quickly into countries, and usually the MDBs are pretty good at that. That they have AAA ratings, so they can really help, particularly with countries that have very high levels of debt and problems with debt sustainability. They can't borrow anymore at certainly not at market rates, and they really need to be able to access highly concessional finance. Not all countries have access to that, and so that really needs to be expanded. And I do see, for example, Inter-American Development Bank going to some effort now to bring together other MDBs to try and make these debt for resilience swaps much easier. So that's a good way of sort of offloading expensive debt and using the sort of savings to invest in resilience, providing the kind of fiscal space that's needed for those investments. What we cannot have is countries that spend so much on repaying debt that they just don't have any money to invest in resilience, because then they get stuck in this kind of vicious circle, if you like. So I think any innovation like that, where the MDBs can really help, make borrowing a lot cheaper, improve the terms, longer term finance. Some of these climate resilient debt clauses, meaning that they don't have to pay back debt when there is a disaster, so that at least that then money can be focused on recovery. All of these, I think, are great innovations at the macro level, but they only really solve part of the problem. I think, as Diane and others were saying, like, you have to get the finance down into communities and where people need it. And one of the innovations that's taken a long time to happen, which I was particularly kind of impressed by in Dominica after the hurricane in 2017, there was a big focus on community resilience, on really understanding what it would take for communities to be able to cope, manage, sustain themselves for up to 2 weeks after a disaster with no external support. Now that's really important. It's a mountainous country. Communities get cut off very quickly, very easily, and can be cut off for a very long time, as they can be in Colombia and other places. So it's really important. If you start from there, what is it that communities need? And you begin to identify some of the preparedness, the food, the medical supplies, the water, the energy, as well as the small-scale kind of mitigation works to stabilize slopes and improve access roads and bridges that are going to allow them to be able to continue to have access. That's where I think we need to get the finance. And it's taken this long, but they've just had a project approved October 2025, 7 years later, a community resilience enhancement project that will help address some of these issues. So faster and cheaper finance flowing into a lot of these really good ideas. Thanks.
Okay, of course, to you. So, speaking about community, you were sharing challenges across political will. But when we look at infrastructure resilience or building anything around infrastructure, a lot of how it is politically looked at is from the lens of asset creation, asset protection, and making those assets sustainable. How would resilience look like in your country and beyond when we see them through the lens of people, whether they are workers, communities, or the most vulnerable? What should we then create, and and how do we ensure that are in real terms sustainable?
Well, I think the way people actually see the things, it's deeply manipulated by media, and nowadays even by social media and some other ways of communication. In the case of Colombia, it's a society that is deeply polarized, especially because this government, the one that I belong to, is the first leftist government in the history of the country. So it's a kind of transition government that is somehow creating this fracture with the past and with very powerful oligarchs. So communication, it's manipulated, so a lot of people doesn't even care about something that may cost their lives. I think there is something I would like to share here with you, and it's like we have proposed a bill to upgrade the unit, the UNGRD, the one that I'm running, into administrative department. In Colombia, we have ministers and we have directors from something that we call administrative department. So we are proposing this bill, as a president will say, a beautiful bill, a fantastic bill, a big bill. It's really a fantastic bill. I mean, we worked like for a year in that bill. We hired great lawyers, people that know a lot about constitution, our technicians, engineers, people with a lot of experience, decades of experience in this matter. But after we finish that fantastic build, the bill is just inside some cabinet and no one is paying attention to that bill. Because the Congress, they don't have any interest in this. They just want to attack the president. They just want to blackmail the government in order to get some profit from them. The media has no interest in this bill, and there's no any qualified discussion about my beautiful bill, my fantastic bill, right? So it's probably never going to be a real. But we propose this department that will be called an adaptation department. In Spanish, this is kind of a cool name because it's called Departamento de Adaptación, Riesgo y Respuesta. So it's like administrative department of risk and adaptation. And that actually sound dar, that it's the same sound of the verb to give, right? So it's a beautiful bill. And we will also proposing to turn the adaptation fund into a national agency of adaptation that will have a beautiful woman's name, Ana. Agencia Nacional de Adaptación, ANA, right? So we will need this kind of institution that people actually get this appropriated, to actually fight for them and defend this institution from any other government that comes. But unfortunately, my beautiful bill will not be real. It's there. I can share the bill with you. It's in Spanish, but
No, I'm just amazed at how beautifully the second chain of conversations, smoothly just weaved into community and placing women at the heart of this change. But for this round, my last question to you, Lincoln, is that talking about a lot of infrastructures and assets, ports, roads, airports, everything that we build are for communities, right? So this is, in a way, those for whom we are building that resilience. First, what is Brazil doing differently that would ensure that some of these infrastructures have adaptation and community thinking embedded in it? And if not, what are the gaps that worry you the most?
Thanks for the question. I think this is one of the way to implement the NDC and NAPS. Brazil is one of the main targets for 2035 is that most of the infrastructure that we build, new building, is to have to consider risk resilience. So this is a very political direction that we have. So all the new infrastructure, we have to consider this risk analysis. So why this? Because the Brazilian government is considered that this is not environmental agenda; it's a human development agenda. So and then I think this is all these aspects. It's very crucial when I mentioned in my previous intervention that multi-sectorial and multi-governance. So there is another issues that we think that's important to bring these discussions that no one will be able to implement this agenda alone. So I think this is exchange of experience, acknowledgement, capacity. It's very crucial to, not for Brazilian advancing in this agenda, but the other countries also, especially in South America, also increase this agenda. So just a very short remark to close the session. In our perspective, I really enjoy and hope that when we come back home, we think that remember this COP as an adaptation again, its chaos, cities again, strong voice and multi-level governments become a pathway toward more resilience, just and human future. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
No, we aren't closed yet. because
Sorry.
we are in closed ears, because I think that when I'm chairing any session, I don't think any conversation around climate action can ever be closed. And the way forwards that we discussed are exactly what we are talking through in the panel. But in the interest of time, I would want to have a rapid fire where I would want to take the takeaways from you all. So we are in COP. Just imagine yourself for 1 minute as the COP presidency yourself. And if that, what is the single, and we are not getting into the details, but what is the single change that you would mandate to ensure that every country and across regions integrate disaster resilient infrastructure into its national adaptation strategy?
You just make everything cheaper, accessible, technology staff you need accessible, the people you need accessible, you know who they are. You can then go and shop for your money. Like a woman want to shop with confidence, you shop for your engineer with confidence, you shop your bank with confidence. It's just too many barriers to just even do something as simple as that. There's a market failure for climate change, and there is so much demand for this money, and there's more money than there is projects. There's something not connecting. If we can just do something to connect that in a way that we can all afford, I mean, this would just, we wouldn't even need COP anymore.
Okay, so if I held the COP presidency, I would make it a recommendation that it becomes a requirement for a climate risk assessment to be done during the design phase of any infrastructure program. So not only an environmental impact assessment, which already gets done in most countries, but also a climate risk assessment. And the reason I think so is firstly because that would force the infrastructure developers to consider climate risks such as heat waves and floods at the design stage of a project before construction has even begun. Secondly, making it legally binding means it's not just a recommendation or a guideline, it is something that has to be done before any infrastructure project gets approved, right? And thirdly, because the climate funds prioritize projects that emphasize resilience, if you have a project that has been designed with climate risk in mind, then you're automatically aligning it with the interests of the climate funds and therefore attracting finance for your infrastructure project.
Thanks, good question. I would approve, if I was COP president, I would approve a very ambitious adaptation finance goal, and because I think that's going to really encourage a lot of the climate finance to go towards adaptation, and really get some really strong language around aligning all financial flows with climate resilient development, and make sure that that is a critical agenda item going forward, and not just a couple of climate funds, but really all of our financial flows. And I think that would make a huge difference for making that money available.
Thank you. Well, this is kind of a very simple question. If I were the president, and I also, if I had a magic wand, I also press capitalism. You know, this is everything is about profit. Everything is about these profit-driven agendas. If you look at the rich neighborhoods in Colombia, they are pretty safe. They're pretty resilient. The problem is for poor people. The poorer the area is, the more in danger they are. So we have to get rid of that huge injustice in the world.
Now, to conclude, I think that the main message is to first is to recognize that climate change is real and this is happening right now. We are not talking about the future, and based on that, following our colleague said, it's very crucial to consider the climate risk analysis in the new project. And then we have to look all these elements as an opportunity, not as a challenge. So this is, I think it's important to take in account. That's it. Thank you.
So we will recognize the scale and the amount of challenge and the unpredictable challenge that climate brings with itself. We will do the risk assessments in a way where we ensure that infrastructure is, resilience is mainstreamed from the very beginning and at the core of new infrastructures that are being built. Of course, there's a need for adaptation finance. We can't emphasize on that enough. But one of the things that we would have to shift, unfortunately, from the COP presidency and take it to the UN is actually talking about the validity of capitalism itself. But that was a trigger point. Thank you so much, panelists, for joining us in this very engaging discussion. I'm sure that we will have more bilaterals or some trilaterals if anybody have any question. But I think in the interest of time, I'll close the formal discussion here. Thank you, everyone, for listening in.